Black Wednesday. Now what could be so important about Black Wednesday? Well, it was the day that a man named George Soros broke the bank of a country. No, not just any country, but England, the richest country in the world at that time. It was also the day that he made $1 billion in less than 2 hours. But here's the thing, he only had $10 million to begin with. So how did this even happen? Well, let's start from the very beginning. You see, back in 1992, George Soros was a billionaire, but his fortune wasn't quite as big as it would later become. And he was looking for some new ways to invest his money. Now, you see, investing your money is like gambling. You have to put your money into something and hope it goes up. But there's always a risk that it might go down instead. And that's why investing is called investing rather than gambling. But the question is, what do you invest in and how do you minimize the risk? Well, there's one type of investment known as asymmetric risk. And that's where the downside is small, but the upside is massive. For example, imagine buying a house. If you buy a house for $100,000, the worst that can happen is you lose everything. But George Soros wanted more. He wanted something that had a lot of asymmetric risk. And that's when he heard about this story. You see, a little while before this story takes place, the British government decided to join the European exchange rate mechanism, which is basically a group of countries that set fixed exchange rates. This meant that the value of the pound sterling would be locked to the German Deutschmark, and this made a lot of sense because it helped to control inflation. But there was a problem. You see, the UK had a lot of inflation, but Germany didn't. And that meant that the UK had to raise interest rates to match those of Germany. But this caused all sorts of problems for the UK economy. Interest rates were high, inflation was still high, and people weren't making enough money. And that led them to start borrowing money. They borrowed and spent and borrowed some more, but then something unexpected happened. The German government lowered their interest rates, but the British government kept theirs high. And that made it very expensive for Britain to borrow money, and this created a serious problem. See, now that interest rates were higher in Britain than they were in Germany, people started to sell their pounds and buy Deutschmarks because they knew that they would get a higher interest rate. But this put pressure on the British government to keep raising interest rates. And soon enough, they wouldn't be able to afford it anymore. Basically, the British economy was in a bubble. And if it popped, it would cause a huge financial crisis. So the British government did something desperate. They turned to the Bank of England and asked them to intervene in the currency markets. In other words, they wanted the bank to stop the fall of the pound by buying it up. And so that's exactly what they did. The Bank of England spent billions of dollars buying pounds, but it didn't work. The pound continued to fall. So they decided to do something even more drastic. They raised interest rates to the highest level in history, but this had some unintended consequences. See, when interest rates are high, banks make a lot of money because they can charge more on loans. But when the interest rates are suddenly raised, people don't have time to adjust. And that can cause a lot of problems, especially for the banking industry, and that's exactly what happened. Some of the biggest banks in Britain collapsed and the whole economy was in shambles. And that's when George Soros stepped in. You see, he noticed that the pound had been falling for a long time. And he thought that maybe it was finally time for it to stop. So he began to bet against the pound, and here's how that works. When you bet against a currency, you're essentially saying that it's going to go down. And if it does, you win money, but if it goes up, you lose money. In fact, the reason why George Soros became famous for breaking the Bank of England is because he bet against the pound and won. But here's the thing, he didn't actually break the bank. He just profited from it, and that's what makes him such a good investor. He doesn't try to beat the market. Instead, he simply finds inefficiencies and exploits them. And that's exactly what he did with the pound. He saw that the pound was overvalued and that the Bank of England was trying to keep it there, so he bet against the pound and waited. Sure enough, the bubble burst and the pound fell, causing massive chaos in the process. George Soros ended up making $1 billion in less than 2 hours. And that's why he's considered to be one of the greatest investors of all time. But some people say that there is no such thing as luck. Everything is simply a matter of probability. And if you understand probability, you can basically predict what's going to happen. And that's exactly what George Soros did. He understood the probability of the bubble bursting and he took advantage of it. But the real question is, how much did he actually profit from this trade? After all, he only invested $10 million. So how could he possibly make $1 billion? Well, the answer lies in the way that he invests. You see, when George Soros places a bet, he doesn't just bet with the money that he has. He borrows money and uses leverage to increase his potential returns. And that's how he was able to make $1 billion in a single day. But not everyone is as lucky as George Soros. In fact, most people end up losing money when they try to do this. But that's not because they don't understand the concept. It's because they don't understand probabilities. They think that just because they have a 50% chance of winning, they will make money overall. But that's not true. If you want to make money with asymmetric risk, you need to make sure that the reward outweighs the risk. And that's why you should never gamble. Now, someone might say that there is no such thing as luck and everything comes down to probability. But even if that were true, it still wouldn't justify what George Soros did. What he did was actually illegal. See, the reason why the pound crashed was because of all the chaos that was going on in the markets. There was so much uncertainty that people didn't know what to do. And that's when George Soros took advantage of the situation. He placed massive orders for pounds, which caused the price to jump. And then he sold those pounds for a huge profit. But he didn't just do that once, he did it again and again and again. And that's why he made so much money. But here's the thing, he was taking advantage of the system. He was exploiting the chaos, and that's why he got banned from the London Stock Exchange. The chairman of the London Stock Exchange said, "We believe that over a period of time, his activities have resulted in disorderly markets. We do not want him to trade on our markets." But George Soros wasn't done yet. He moved to the foreign exchange markets, where he continued to exploit inefficiencies and make millions upon millions of dollars. And that's how he became the billionaire that we know today. But some people say that he's not a billionaire at all. They say he's just a multimillionaire who's really good at marketing himself. But either way, there's no denying that he is one of the most successful investors of all time. So the question is, what can we learn from him? Well, for one, we can learn that sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart. But more importantly, we can learn that it is okay to take risks as long as we understand the probability of the outcome. If George Soros hadn't taken the risk, he wouldn't have made $1 billion. But more importantly, if he had lost the bet, he would have only lost $10 million, which is nothing compared to what he gained. You don't need billions to think like Soros. Start asking, where are systems weak? Where is the risk reward in your favor? Are you willing to make bold moves with a clear thesis? Because sometimes one smart bet can change your life. Thanks for watching.